Chapter 11 of Brood of the Dark Moon by Charles Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Sacrificial Altar. "I'm off the trail," Harkness admitted. "Towahg guided me before. I wish he were here to do it now." They had pushed on for another short day, Harkness leading and Chet bringing up the rear and casting frequent backward glances in a vain effort to catch a glimpse of some other moving figure. Smothered at times in a dense tangle of vegetation where they sweated and worked with aching muscles to tear a path, watching always for the flaming crimson buds on grotesque trees whose limbs were waving, undulating arms and from which came tendrils like the one that had nearly ended Diane's life, they fought their way on. They had seen the buds on that earlier trip and had seen the revolting beauty of them, the fleshy lips that opened above a pool of death into which those reaching arms would drop any living thing they touched. They kept well out of reach when a splash of crimson against the white trees flashed in warning. Again they would traverse an open space where outcropping rocks would send Kreiss into transports of delight over their rich mineral contents. But always their leader's eyes were turned toward a range of hills. "It is beyond there," he assured them. "If only we can reach it." Harkness pointed to a scar on a mountainside where a crystal outcrop in a sheer face of rock sparkled brilliantly in the sunlight. "I remember that. It isn't so very far, and we can look back down the valley from there and see our ship." "But we'll never make it tonight," said Chet. "It's a case of making camp again." They had gained an altitude of perhaps 1,000 feet. No longer did the jungle press so hard upon them. Even the single file that had been their manner of marching could be abandoned, and Harkness drew Diane to his side that he might lend her some of his own strength. Again the soft contours of the rolling ground had been disturbed. A landslide in some other century had sent a torrent of boulders from the high slopes above. Harkness threaded his way among great masses of granite to come at last to an opening where massive monoliths formed a gateway. It was an entrance to another valley. They did not need to enter, for they could skirt it and continue toward the high pass in the hills. But the gateway seemed inviting. Harkness took Diane's hand to help her toward it. The others followed. The fast-sinking sun had buried itself behind a distant range, and long shadows swept swiftly across the world, as if the oncoming night were alive, as if it were rousing from the somnolence of its daytime sleep and reaching out with black and clutching hands toward a fearful, waiting world. "No twilight here," Chet observed. "Let's find a hideout, a cave by choice, where we can guard the entrance and—" A gasp from Diane checked him. "Oh!" she exclaimed. "It is not real. It's impossible." Chet had been busy with the matter of a secure footing. He looked up now and took a step forward where Harkness and Diane stood motionless in a gateway of stone. And he, too, stopped as if stunned by the weird beauty of the scene. A valley, its length reached out before them to end some half-mile away. Sides that might once have sloped evenly seemed weathered to a series of great steps, and an alternation of striations in black and white made a banding that encircled the entire oval. Each step was dead black stone, each riser was snow-white marble, and the steps mounted up and up until they resembled the sides of a great bowl. In the center, like an altar for the worship of some wild, gargantuan god, was a stepped pyramid of the same startling black and white. Banded like the walls, it rose to half their height to finish in a capstone cut square and true. An altar, perhaps an arena, beyond doubt, or so it seemed to Chet. He was first to put the impression in words. "A stadium," he marveled. "An arena for the games of the gods." "The gods?" Diane breathed softly. of a wild, lost world, but Chet held to another thought. Who built it?" he asked. "It's tremendous. There is nothing like it on Earth." Only Kreiss seemed oblivious to the weird beauty of the spectacle. To Professor Kreiss, dolomite and black flint rock were dolomite and black flint. Interesting specimens, a peculiar arrangement, but nature must be permitted her little vagaries. "Who built it?" He repeated Chet's question and gave a short laugh before answering in words. "The rains, Herr Bullard, and the winds of ages past. Yes, yes, a most remarkable example of erosion. Most remarkable. I must return this way some time and give it my serious attention." Harkness had not spoken. He was shaking his head doubtfully at Kreiss' words. "I am inclined to agree with Chet," he said slowly. "But who could have built a gigantic work like this? Have there been former civilizations here?" He straightened up and shook himself free from the effects of the wild, barbaric scene. "And you needn't come back," he told Kreiss. "You can have a look now tonight by moonlight. We can't go on. I think it will be safest on that big altar rock. Nothing will get near us without our knowing." Chet felt Diane Delacouer's hand on his arm. Her other hand was gripping at Harkness. The shiver that passed through her was plainly perceptible. "I'm afraid," she confessed in a half whisper. "There's something about it. I do not like it. There is evil there, danger we should not enter." Walt Harkness gently patted the hand that trembled on his arm. "I don't wonder that you were all shot to pieces," he assured her. "After last night you've a right to be. But I really believe this is the safest spot we can find." He stepped forward beyond the great stones that were like a gateway from one wildly impossible world to another. A rock slide, it seemed, had smoothed off the great steps from where they stood, for there was a descending slope that gave easy footing. He took one step and then another to show the girl how foolish were her fears, and then he started back. In the fading light, something had flashed from the jungle they had left. Across the rocky expanse it came, to bury itself in the loose soil and rubble, not 2 paces in advance of the startled man. An arrow, and it stood quivering in silent warning on the path ahead. Chet quietly unslung his bow where he had looped it over one shoulder, but Harkness motioned him back. The pistol was in his hand, but after a moment's hesitation he returned that to his belt. His voice was low and tense. "Listen," he said. "We're no match for them with our bows. They are hidden. They could pick us off as we came, and I can't waste a single detonite shell on them while they keep out of sight. We can't go back. We must go ahead. We will all make a break for it and run as fast as we can toward the big altar, the pyramid. From there we can stand them off for a while, and we will go now and take them by surprise." He seized Diane firmly by one arm and steadied her as they dashed down the slope. Chet and the Professor were close behind. Each spine must have tingled in anticipation of a shower of arrows. Chet threw one hasty look toward the rear. The air was clear. No slender shafts pursued them. But from the cover of the jungle growth came a peculiar sound, almost like a human in distress, a call like a moaning cry. They slackened their breathtaking pace and approached the great pyramid more slowly. As they drew near, the great steps took on their real size. Each block was taller even than Chet, and he had to reach above his head to touch the edge of the stone. They walked quickly about, found a place where the great blocks were broken down, where the slope was littered with debris from the disintegrating stone that had sifted down from above. They could climb here. It was almost like a crudely formed set of more normally sized steps. They made their way upward while Chet counted the courses of stone. 6, then 8, 10, and here Harkness called a halt. "This will do," he gasped between labored breaths. "Safe enough here. Chet, you and Kreiss spread out. Watch from all sides." The pilot was not as badly winded as Harkness, who had been helping Diane. "Stay here," he told Harkness. "You too, Kreiss. Make yourself comfortable. I will go on up to the top. The moon, or the earth, rather, will be up pretty soon. I can keep watch in all directions from up there. We've got to get some sleep. Can't let whoever it is that is trailing us rob us of our rest, or we'll soon be no good. I'll call you after a while." The great capstone projected beyond the blocks that supported it. That much had been apparent from the ground. But Chet was amazed at the size of the monolith when he stood at last on the broad step over which this capstone projected like a roof. The shadows were deep beneath, and Chet, knowing that he could never draw himself to the top of the great slab whose underside he could barely touch, knew also that he must watch from all sides. The shadowed floor beneath the big stone made a shelter from any watchful eyes out there in the night. Here would be his beat as sentry. He walked slowly to the side of the pyramid, then around toward the front. It was the front to Chet because it faced the entrance, the rocky gateway where they had come in. He did not expect to find that side in any way differing from the first. Each side was 20 paces in length. Chet measured them carefully, astounded still at the size of the structure. "Carved by winds and rains," he said, repeating the opinion of Professor Kreiss. "Now I wonder. It seems too regular, too much as if..." He paused in his thoughts as he reached the corner, waited to stare watchfully out into the night, turned the corner, and still in shadow moved on. Too much as if nature had had some help. His meditation ended as abruptly as did his steady pacing. He was checked in mid-stride, one foot outstretched, while he struggled for balance and fought to keep from taking that forward step. In the shelter of the capstone was a darker shadow. There was a blackness there that could mean only the opening of a cave, a cavern whose regular outlines and square-cut portal dismissed for all time the thought of a natural opening in the rock. But it was not this alone that had brought the man up short in his stealthy stride. It had jolted him as if he had walked head on into the great monolith itself. It was not this, but a flat platform before the cave, a raised stone surface some 2 feet above the floor, and on it, pale and unreal in the first light of the rising earth, was a naked human form, a face that grimaced with distorted features. Chet had known the ape-men on that earlier visit. He knew that while most of them were heavily covered with hair, there were some who were almost human in their hairlessness. The body before him was one of these. It lay limply across the stone platform, the listless head hanging downward over one edge. It had high cheekbones, a retreating forehead, glassy, staring eyes, and grinning teeth that projected from between loose lips. And the evening wind stirred the black stringy hair while it touched lightly upon the ends of a short length of vine about the ape-man's neck, where only the ends could be seen, for the rest of the pliant vine was sunk deeply into the flesh of the neck. It had been the instrument of death. The ape-man had been strangled. Chet tore his fascinated eyes from the revolting features of that purple face. He forced himself to look beyond at what else might be on this sacrificial stone, and as he saw the assortment of fruit that was there on a green mat of leaves, the surprise was even greater than would have followed a repetition of the first discovery. A naked, murdered man and ripe fruit. What was the meaning of this? Chet asked himself a score of questions and found the answers to none. But one thing he knew now beyond a doubt: Herr Professor Kreiss had been wrong. This was truly an altar for the performance of unknown and savage rites, and the altar itself and the whole encircling arena had been created by some intelligence. People, things, embodied intelligence of some sort had carved these stones. Chet was oppressed by a feeling of impending danger. His thoughts came back sharply to the things on the stone, the absurdly contrasting exhibits, a naked body and fruit. But were they so different, he asked himself, and knew in the same instant that they were not. They were one and the same. They differed only in kind. They were both food. From the darkness beyond came a shuffling of feet. From the black passage someone was coming, drawing near to the portal and coming slowly, steadily through the dark. The pad of animal feet would have been unnerving, or the stealthy footfalls of an approaching savage, but this was neither. It was a scuffing, shuffling sound. The sweat stood out in beads on Chet's forehead, and a trickle of it reached his eyes. He dashed it away with the back of his hand while he drew silently into the shadow of the overhanging stone. He held his breath as he watched in the darkness. His pistol came noiselessly from his belt. Yet how could he fire it, he asked himself in a moment of frantic planning. Only 7 cartridges left. They would need them all. And to fire now would bring more enemies upon them. He returned the gun to his belt and stooped to weigh a fragment of stone in his hand. This must serve him as a weapon. The dragging footsteps were near, where the passage mouth loomed black. The light of a distant earth struck slantingly across to leave this face of the pyramid in half darkness. From that far and peaceful world the light poured floodingly down. It shone in under the projecting capstone. It struck upon the raised altar and revealed in ghastliest detail the gruesome offering there. And surely the strangest sight of all that the earthlight disclosed was when it shone golden upon a black and hairy body of a beast that was half man, half ape. The creature moved slowly forward, walking erect, with its furry arms stretched gropingly ahead. In the full light it went shuffling on like one who is blind or who walks in the dark, until it stopped before the altar stone and stood rigidly waiting. Waiting for what? Chet was making demands upon his reason that was already taxed beyond its capacity. He heard nothing, and he knew with entire certainty that there was no audible call. Yet he sensed the message at the instant the ape-man moved. "Flesh," said the message. "Bring flesh. Bring it now." And with glazed, wide-open eyes which plainly saw but could not comprehend, the ape-thing stared at the altar stone. It bent forward, took the fresh-killed body by the throat, and slung it across one shoulder as easily as a child might handle a doll. Then it turned and vanished once more into the waiting dark. "God!" breathed Chet, when the vision had passed. "God help us! What does it mean?" He took one backward step, then another, and made his way in silence along the path he had come. He must get back to the others to tell them of what he had seen, to help them to flee from this place of horror that was more terrible for its qualities of the unknown. He gave his companions the story in staccato sentences. And the ape-man was unconscious, he concluded. He was an automaton, only directed by another brain. I know it. I got that message. I tell you, it was radioed by someone or by something, sent directly to that big ape's brain. Now, let's get out of here. Diane had it right when she said that the place was evil, but she didn't make it strong enough. It's foul with evil. It's damned. Come on. I'm leaving now." Chet's whispered words were uttered with all the emphasis that horror could instill. He knew that he spoke truth, but he could not know how mistaken was his last positive assertion. "I'm leaving now," Chet had said, and how desperately he wanted to put this place behind him only he himself could know. He took one step toward the place where they could descend. Then Harkness' hand pulled him roughly to his knees. "Down!" Harkness was commanding. "Get down, Chet! They're coming, a swarm of them, through the gate." The pilot heard them before he saw them. They began a chant as they poured through the entrance, a weird, wailing note like the cry of a stricken animal that cries on and on. Then he saw the swarm. They came in a cataract of black bodies that spilled through the stone portal and down the long slope. They formed a ragged column on the ground and came toward the pyramid, where, unseen, 3 men and a girl from another world were crouching. "Back!" Chet ordered in a whisper. "Keep low in the shadow. Get around in back of the pyramid. We can make a run for it." They crept swiftly along the rocky step where the deep angle was in shadow. They reached the rear slope where Chet had climbed, and each one knew without the speaking of a word that retreat was not to be considered. The open arena, the high bank of great steps in their bold markings of black and white. They could never hope to scale them. They would never even reach them alive, for the savage horde would overwhelm them before they had crossed the earthlit ground. "All right," said Chet, in acceptance of their unspoken thoughts. "Up it is. Here's a hand, Diane. Up you go. Now watch your step and climb as if 1,000 devils were after you, for there's all of that." The wave of bodies was washing against the pyramid's base when Chet drew Kreiss, the last of the 4, into the shadow of the huge capstone. The noise of their climbing had been covered by the wailing cry that came piercingly shrilly from the throng far below. And they had been unseen, Chet was sure, unless that one furtive shadow that he had seen draw away from the crowd and slip around toward the rear of the pyramid meant that someone of the tribe had found their trail. From the front of the shadowed top came the shuffling of heavy, dragging feet on the stone. It was the same as before. Chet had held some vague idea of fighting off the horde from the top of the steps, for here was the only place where they could ascend. He had forgotten this other one for the moment, and he realized in a single flashing instant that here was a worse menace than the pack. Only one, it was true, one ape-man who would be no match for them, but Chet remembered those blind, staring eyes and the message that had come to him. Those eyes had seen the horrible food upon the altar. Some other brain had seen it too. The ape-man was an instrument only. There was some hidden horror in back of him, something that saw with his eyes, something that must never see them, covering and huddled in the shadow of that great stone. The shuffling was coming from the right. Chet clutched silently at the others to draw them away and toward the left. They retreated to the corner, turned it, and went on toward the front, then stopped in silent waiting where the shadow ended. The front where the altar stood was in the full glare of earth. For the moment they were safe, but what of the time when the ape-man returned? He had descended to the ground. When he climbed back up again, would he retrace his steps, or would he come this side and trap them here where the light of their own earth made any forward step impossible? Below them the wailing ceased. Chet leaned forward to see the black horde, silent and motionless. Approaching them was the big ape he had seen at the altar. His hands were reaching blindly before him, and he moved as would a human when entranced. He reached the huddled blacks. His groping hands hovered hesitantly above a cowering, hairy form. Presently the ape-man passed on to the next, and his hands rested on the creature's face. From the massed figures there rose a moan, and Chet felt poignantly the animal's misery of it. Suddenly all emotion was transformed to startled attention. From the slope at the rear had come the rattle of loose stones. Far below, in plain view, was the one who had descended. Chet knew that his eyes could never mistake that blind, groping figure, but from the slope they could not see. From around the far edge of the pyramid, a clicking stone sent a repeated warning. Chet laid a hand on Harkness' arm. "Get set, Walt," he warned. "Get ready for trouble. There's something coming. It may come this way." End of chapter 11. Of Brood of the Dark Moon by Charles Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In the shadow of the pyramid. They waited, unbreathing, listening to the occasional stealthy sounds. The pistol was still in Chet's belt. The three men were crouched before Diane, in their hands the crude weapons that they had made. And then the sounds ceased. The menace seemed to have passed, or to be withheld. The men had been tensely prepared for some minutes when Diane spoke softly. "Look below," she whispered. "The savages. That big one seems to be choosing them, selecting some from among them." Chet forced himself to look away from that corner of the rocky step where he had been expecting an unknown enemy to appear, and he stared below them where the earth light from the fully risen globe swept across the arena. He was amazed at the number of the savages that the full light disclosed. There were hundreds, yes, thousands of them, he estimated, and they were standing in black clotted masses, standing awed and silent in a world that was all black and white in a dazzling contrast, while there passed among them one with outstretched arms. The black hairy hands would hover over a cowering head. The eyes, Chet knew, were staring widely, blindly at the shivering creature before him. And if Chet's surmise was correct, there was another, a hidden, mysterious something who was taking the message of those eyes as the ape-man's brain transmitted it, taking it and sending back instructions as to which victim should be selected. Often the hands passed on, but soon they would descend to touch the savage face of another in the assemblage. At the touch, the selected one jerked sharply erect, then walked stiffly from the ranks to join a group that was waiting. At last there were nearly 100 savage figures in that group, all grown men, young and in the full flood of their savage strength. No women were chosen, nor children, though there were countless little black bodies huddled with the others. A prolific race indeed, Chet thought, and this human automaton down there was leaving the women to produce more victims, leaving the children till they were fully grown, taking only the best and strongest of the pack. For what? His question was answered in part in the next instant. While the wailing cry quivered again upon the air, the chosen 100 took up their somnambulistic walk. The messenger from the pyramid came after like a herdsman driving cattle to the slaughter. They passed from Chet's view as they rounded the rear of the pyramid, and then he heard the scuff and clatter of their ascent. No need to explain to the others. Each of the four saw all too clearly their predicament. From the rear, coming steadily on, was the savage throng. Before them, plainly visible from below, was the lighted edge where the altar rock stood. To step out there in full view would bring the whole pack upon them. To drop down to another level would expose them as plainly. Only in the dark shelter of the projecting capstone were they hidden from the upturned faces now massed solidly about. Their problem was solved for them by the sight of a savage body, black, ragged, with unkempt tufts of hair. Another, a score of them. They were rounding the corner of the pyramid and walking stiffly toward them, pressing upon them. And the arrow on the drawn bow in Chet's hand was never loosed, for each savage face was wide-eyed and devoid of expression. The ape-men neither saw nor felt them. They were hypnotized, as Chet was suddenly aware. They knew only that they must follow the mental instructions that were guiding them on. The black animal bodies were upon them. Chet came from the stupefying wonder that had claimed them all and sprang to shield the group from the steady advance. Harkness was beside him, and an instant later, Kreiss. Diane was at their backs, and the weight of the advancing party swept them irresistibly backward, out into the light, along the wide step toward the passage that yawned darkly under the projecting cap. There was no checking the avalanche of bodies, no resisting them. The men were carried along. It was all they could do to keep their footing. Harkness sprang backward to take Diane in his arms and retreat with her before the advancing horde. Chet was waiting for an outcry from below, for some indication that despite the mass of bodies that smothered them, their presence had been observed. But only the wailing cry persisted. There was another advancing column that had circled the other side, and now both groups were meeting at the passageway. Chet gripped at the figure of Kreiss, who was being swept helpless toward the dark vault, and he dragged him back. The two fought their way out toward the front and saw Harkness doing the same. "The altar!" gasped Chet. Up on the altar, and he saw Harkness swing Diane up on the stone, then turned and extended a helping hand toward the two men. Safe in the sanctuary of this altar, dedicated to some deity that they could never imagine, they crouched close to its blood-clotted surface, and still there was no change in the cry from below. "Let them all go in," Harkness whispered, "then follow them into the shadow. There will no more come up here. I imagine we will make our escape after a bit." The black mouth of the passage had swallowed the ape-men by solid scores, and now only some stragglers were left. Harkness was speaking in quick, whispered orders. "Follow the last ones. Keep stooped over so they won't spot us from below. Wait in the darkness of the entrance." Chet saw him crouch low as he crept from the stone. Diane followed, then Kreiss and Chet next, close behind a shambling ape figure that slunk into the darkness of the passageway. That it was a passage, Chet had not the least doubt. It had taken in these scores of savage figures, taken them somewhere, but where it led, or why these poor stunned creatures had been chosen, he could not know. Yet he remembered the one message he had caught. Flesh, bring flesh. It had meant only one thing. It was food that was wanted, human food. And the fetid stench that was wafted from the darkness of this place of mystery and horror, that made him reel back and put a hand to his revolted lips, would not have encouraged him, even had he had any desire to learn the answer to the puzzle. Diane was half crouching. She was choking with the foul air. Harkness spoke gaspingly as he took her by the arm. "Outside, for God's sake! Horrible! Get Diane outside. Try lying down. We may be out of sight." But this time he did not follow his own instructions. He rose erect, instead, and stood swaying as if dazed, and Chet saw that before him, outlined against the lighted opening in the rock, was the messenger he had seen. Black against the bright earth light, his features were lost. No expression could be seen, but his eyes, that were dead and white like the upturned belly of a fish, came suddenly to life. They glared from the dark face with a light that came almost visibly from them to the staring eyes of Walt Harkness. Chet saw Harkness stiffen, one upraised hand falling woodenly to his side. A cry of warning was strangled in his throat, and then the glaring eyes passed on to the face of Diane. Chet had forgotten this messenger from the pyramid's hidden horror. If he had thought of him at all, he had assumed that he had passed in with the other crowding ape-men. He was one like them, undistinguishable from the rest. And now the savage figure was before them in terrifying reality. The eyes passed on to Kreiss. Then the ugly face swung toward Chet, and as their eyes met, it seemed to Chet that a blow had crashed stunningly upon his brain. He tried to move. He knew that he must move. He must reach for his bow, must leap upon this hulking brute and beat at the glaring eyes with his bare fists. And his muscles that he tried to rouse to action might have changed to stone, so unresponsive were they and unmoving. The hairy hands reached out and touched Harkness. They passed on and lingered upon the blanched features of the girl, and Chet raged inwardly at his inability to resist and her utter helplessness to draw away. Then Kreiss, and again Chet's turn. And with the touching of those rough animal hands, he felt that a contact had been established with some distant force, a something that communicated with him, that sent thoughts which his brain phrased in words. "Curious," said those thoughts. "How exceedingly curious! We shall be interested in learning more. We shall learn all we can in one way and another of this new race. We shall dismember them slowly, all but the woman. We find her strangely attractive. You will bring them to us at once." And Chet knew that the instructions were for the messenger whose hands came stiffly upward to point the way, while with a portion of his mind that was functioning freely, Chet raged as he saw Diane take the first stiff, involuntary step forward. Then Harkness and Kreiss, and he knew that he too must follow, knew himself to be as helpless as the driven brutes he had seen herded down below. And then, with the same mind that was still able to comprehend the messages of his own eyes and ears, he knew that from behind the savage figure there had come a sound. His senses were alert, sharpened to an abnormal degree. The almost silent footfall otherwise could never have been heard. The raised hand swung toward him. He knew that he must turn and follow the others to whatever waited, but the hand paused. Then swiftly the savage figure swung the face toward the entrance, and those blazing eyes, as Chet knew, were a match for any opponent. But the eyes never found what they looked for, and the quick swing of the big ape body was never completed. In the portal of light there was framed a naked figure which sprang as if from nowhere, squat, savage and ape-like, but hairless. Its arms were upraised, the hands held a bow, and the twang of the bowstring came as one with the rippling thud of a shaft that was tearing through flesh. The savage fell in mid-turn, and it seemed as if the blazing light of the terrible eyes must have flickered out before the breath of death, and protruding from the thick neck was the shaft of a crude arrow. There were others that flashed, thudding and quivering, into the body that jerked with each impact, then lay still, a darker blot on the floor of a dark cave. Chet was breathless. It was an instant before he realized that he was free, that the hypnotic bonds that had bound him were loosed. It was another instant before he sensed that his companions were still marching, trudging stiffly, woodenly, off through the dark. He bounded after, heedless of bruising walls. He followed where the sound of their scuffling feet marked their progress to a sure doom. There were stairs. How he sensed them Chet could not have told, but he paused, hesitated a moment, then found the first step and half ran, half fell through the utter darkness of the pit into which they had gone. The odors that had seemed the utmost of vileness now came to him 100 times worse. They tore at his throat with a strangling grip, and he was weak with nausea when he crashed upon a figure that he knew was Kreiss, then on to grasp at Diane and Harkness, to drag them to a standstill in the darkness that pressed upon them smotheringly, while he shook them, beat at them, shouted their names. "Diane! Walt! Wake up! Wake up, I tell you! We're going back!" He swung them around, forced them to face about. "Walt, for God's sake, wake up! Diane! Kreiss!" The deep sobbing breath of Diane was the first encouraging response. Then, "Free!" she gasped. "I'm free!" And Harkness and Kreiss both mumbled incoherently as they came from their hypnotic stupor. "How," began Harkness, "how did you?" But Chet waited for no explanation of the seeming miracle that had just taken place. "Go back," he told them, "back up the steps," and a babel of cries that were terrifying in their inhuman savagery welled up from the depths of the pyramid to urge them on. The body of their captor was prone on the floor above. They stepped over it to reach the entrance. No figure showed there now. Chet stooped low and stepped forth cautiously, that the surging horde on the ground might not see him. The others followed. He felt Harkness' hand in a sudden warning grip upon him. "Chet," said Harkness, "there is something there in the shadow there." and Chet saw, even before Walt pointed, a wriggling figure that crept toward them. He struck down the bow that Kreiss had raised, and a ray of light came through a jagged niche in the rock above to fall upon the face of the one who drew near. Abjectly, in almost humility, the naked figure crept toward their feet, and the savage face that was raised to theirs was wreathed in a distorted smile. Beside him, Chet felt Harkness struggling to speak. In wondering tones that were almost unbelieving, Harkness choked out one word. "Towahg," he said. "Towahg." And the thick lips in that upraised face echoed proudly, "Towahg, me come." End of chapter 12. Of Brood of the Dark Moon by Charles Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Happy Valley. "Towahg," Chet marveled, "you little devil. It's you who has been following us all this time." "I wish he hadn't been so bashful," Harkness added. "If he had come out and showed himself, he would have saved us a lot of trouble." But Harkness stepped forward and patted the black shoulder that quivered with joy beneath his touch. "Good boy, Towahg," he told the grinning ape-man. Monkey-like, Towahg had to imitate, and this time he gave a reproduction of his own acts. He wriggled toward the entrance of the passage, peered around the edge, and seemed to see something that made him draw back. Then he fitted an arrow to his bow and, springing upright, let it fly. So realistic was the performance that Chet actually expected to see another enemy transfixed, but the squat figure of Towahg was doing a dance of victory beside the prostrate figure of the first and only victim. Chet reached out with one long arm and swung the exulting savage about. He heard Herr Kreiss expressing his opinion in accents of disgust. "Ugly little beast," Kreiss was saying, "and murderous." There was no time to lose. The sound of scrambling bodies was coming nearer from the dark pit beyond. Yet even then Chet found an instant to defend the black. "Damned lucky for us that he is a murderer," he told Kreiss. Then to Towahg, "Listen, you little imp of hell, you don't know more than 10 words, but get this." Chet was standing where the earthlight struck upon him. He pointed into the dark where the sounds of pursuit grew loud, and he shook his head and screwed his features into an expression that was supposed to depict fear. "No, no," he said. He dragged the savage forward and pointed cautiously to the milling horde below, and repeated, "No, no." Then he included them all in a wave of his hand and pointed back and out into the night. And Towahg's unlovely features were again twisted in to what was for him a smile, as he grunted some unintelligible syllables and motioned for them to follow. It had taken but an instant. Towahg was scurrying in advance. He sped like a shadow of a passing cloud, and behind him the others followed, crouching low in the shelter of the deep-cut step. No figures were below them at the rear of the pyramid, and Chet reached for one of Diane's arms, while Harkness took the other. Between them they held her from falling while they followed the dark blur that was Towahg, leaping noiselessly down the long slope. No time for caution now. The savage ahead of them leaped silently. His flying feet hardly disturbed a stone. But beneath them Chet felt a small landslide of rubble that came with them in their flight. And above the noise of their going came a sound that sped them on, the rising shout of wonder from the unseen multitude in front, and a chorus of animal cries from the pyramid's top. Chet saw a blot of black figures at the top of the slope just as they felt firm ground beneath their feet. They followed where Towahg led, in a swift race across the open arena toward the great steps at the rear. Black and white in strongly contrasting bands, the rocks reared itself in a barrier that, to Chet, seemed hopelessly unsurmountable. He felt that they had come to the end of their tether. Trapped, he told himself, and wondered at Towahg's leading them into such a cul-de-sac, even while he knew that retreat in other directions was cut off. The pursuit was gaining on them. Savages from beyond the pyramid had sighted them now in the full light of Earth, and their yelping cry came mingled with hoarse growls as the full pack took the trail. Ahead of them, Towahg, reaching the base of the first white step, was dancing with excitement beside a narrow cleft in the rocks. He led the way through the small passage, and Harkness, bringing up the rear, took the detonite pistol in his hand. "One shell, we'll have to waste it," he said, and raised the weapon. Its own explosion was slight, but the sound of the bursting cartridge when its grain of detonite struck the rocks made a thunderous noise as it echoed between the narrow walls. "That will check the pursuit," Harkness exulted. "That will make them stop and think it over." It was another hour before Towahg slackened his pace. He had led them through jungle that to them seemed impassable, had shown them the hidden trails and warned them against spiked plants whose darts were needle sharp. At last he led them to a splashing stream where they followed him through the trackless water for a mile or more. The mountain with the white scar was their beacon. Harkness pointed it out to their guide and made him understand that that was where they would go. And when night was gone and the first rays of the rising sun made a quick changing kaleidoscope of the colorful east, they came at last to a barren height. Behind them was a maze of valleys and rolling hills. Beyond these was a place of smoke where red fires shone pale in the early light, and set off at one side was a shape whose cylindrical outline could be plainly seen. It caught the first light of the sun to reflect it in sparkling lines and glittering points, and every reflection came back to them tinted with pale green, by which they knew that the gas was still there. Chet turned from a prospect that could only be depressing. His muscles were heavy with the poisons of utter fatigue. The others must be the same, but for the present they were safe, and they could find some position that they could defend. Towahg would be a valuable ally, and now their lives were ahead of them, lives of loneliness, of exile. Harkness, too, had been staring back toward that ship that was their only link with their lost world. His eyes met Chet's in an exchange of glances that showed how similar were their thoughts. Then, at the sound of a glad laugh from Diane, their looks of despair gave place to something more like shame, and Chet shifted his own eyes quickly away. "It is beautiful, Walter," Diane was saying. "The lovely valley, the lake, the three mountain peaks like sentinels. It is marvelous, and we will be happy there, all of us. I know it. Happy Valley. There, I've named it. Do you like the name, Walter?" And Chet saw Harkness reply in a quick pressure of his hand on one of Diane's, and he knew that Walt looked suddenly away without giving her an answer in words. Happy Valley. Diane, of all the four, had shown the ability to rise above desperate physical weariness, above a despondent mood, to dare look ahead instead of backward, and to find hope for happiness in the prospect. Off at one side, Chet saw Kreiss. The scientist's weariness was forgotten while he ran like a puppy after a bird in pursuit of a floating butterfly that drifted like a wind-blown flower. And Harkness, unspeaking, was still clinging to Diane's firm hand. Yes, thought Chet, there was happiness to be found here. For himself, it would be more than a little lonesome. But, he reflected, what happiness there was in any place or thing more than the happiness we put there for ourselves. Happy Valley, and why not? He dared to meet the girl's eyes now, and the smile on his lips spread to his own eyes as he echoed his thoughts. "Why not?" he asked. "Happy Valley it is. We just didn't recognize it at first." They came to the lake at last. Its sparkling blue had drawn them from afar off. It was still lovelier as they came near. Here was the same steady west wind that had driven the gas upon their ship, but here it ruffled the velvet of waving grasses that swept down to the margin of the lake. There was a higher knoll that rose sharply from the shore, and back of all were forests of white-trunked trees. Chet had seen none of the crimson buds, nor threatening tendrils since entering the valley, and Towahg confirmed his estimate of the valley's safety. He waved one naked arm in an all-inclusive gesture, and he drew upon his limited vocabulary to tell them of this place. "Good," he said, and waved his arm again. "Good, good." "Towahg, you're a silver-tongued orator," Chet told him. "No one could have described it better. You're darned right. It's good." He raised his head to take a deep breath of the fragrant air. It was intoxicating with its blending of spicy odors. At his feet the water made emerald waves, where the clear deep blue of the reflected sky merged with yellow sand. Fish darted through the deeper pools where the beach shelved off, and above them the air held flashing colorful things that circled and skimmed above the waves. The rippling grass was so green, the sky and lake so intense a blue, and one mountainous mass of clouds shone in a white too blinding to be borne, and over it all flowed the warm, soft air that seemed vibrant with a life force pulsing strongly through this virgin world. Diane called from where she and Harkness had wandered through the lush grass. Kreiss had thrown himself upon a strip of warm sand and was oblivious to the beauties that surrounded him. Towahg was squatted like a half-human frog, binding new heads on his arrows. "Chet," she called, "come over here and help me to exclaim over this beautiful place. Walter talks only of building a house and arranging a place that we can defend. He is so very practical." "Practical!" exclaimed Chet. "Why, Walt's a dreamer and a poet compared to me. I'm thinking of food. Hey, Towahg," he called to the black, "let's eat." He amplified this with unmistakable pointings at his mouth and suggestive rubbings of his stomach, and Towahg started off at a run toward the trees that were heavy with strange fruit. By night there was an unmistakable sign that the hand of man had been at work. A band of savages would have accepted the place as they found it. For them the shelter of a rock would have sufficed. They would have passed on to other hunting grounds, and only a handful of ashes and a broken branch, perhaps, would have marked where they had been. But your civilized man is never satisfied. Along the mile of shore was open ground. Here the trees approached the water. Again their solid rampart of ghostly trunks was held back some hundreds of yards, and the open ground was vividly green where the soft grass waved, and it was matted, too, with crimson and gold of countless flowers. A beautiful carpet flung down by the edge of a crystal lake, and the flowered covering swept up and over the one high knoll that touched the shore, and on the knoll, near an outcrop of limestone rocks, was a house. "Not exactly pretentious," Chet had admitted, "but we'll do better later on." "It will keep Diane under cover," argued Harkness. "These leaves are like leather." He helped Diane put another strip of leaf in place on the roof. A twist of green vine tied around the stem held it loosely. The leaves were huge, as much as 10 feet in diameter, great circles of leathery green that they cut with a pocket knife and tailored, as Diane called it, to fit the rough framework of the hut. Towahg had found them and had given them a name that they did not trouble to learn. "Towahg's grunts sound so much alike," Diane complained smilingly. "He seems to know his natural history, but he is difficult to understand." But Towahg proved a valuable man. He cracked 2 round stones together and cleaved off one to a rounded edge. He bound this with withes to a short stick, and in a few minutes had a serviceable stone axe that bit into slender saplings that were needed for a framework. Chet nodded his head and called Kreiss' attention to that. "Herr Doctor," he said, "it isn't every scientist who has a chance to see close up of the Stone Age." But Kreiss, as Chet told Harkness later, did not seem to snuggle up nice and friendly to the grinning savage. "He is armed better than we," Kreiss complained. "I do not trust him. It is an impossible situation, this, that civilized man should be dependent upon one so savage. For what is our culture, our great advancement in all lines of mental endeavor, if at last, when tested by nature, we must rely upon such assistance?" Chet saw Herr Doktor Kreiss draw himself aloof with meticulous care as Towahg dashed by, and it occurred to him that perhaps it was as well for Kreiss that the black one knew so little of what he said. But aloud he merely said, "You'll have lots of chances to use that mental endeavor stuff later on, Doctor. But right now what we need to know is how to get by without any of your laboratories, without textbooks or tools, with just our bare hands, and with brains that are geared up to the civilization you mention and don't do us a whole lot of good here. Better let Towahg show us what he knows." But Herr Kreiss only shrugged his thin shoulders and wandered off through this research man's paradise, where every flower and insect and stone were calling to him. Chet envied the equanimity with which the man had accepted his lot, had come to this place, and was prepared to spend his remaining years collecting scientific data that were to him all important. Again the sun sank swiftly, but this time Chet stretched himself luxuriously upon the matted grass and turned to stare at the little fire that burned before the entrance of Diane's shelter. His pocket fire flash had kindled some dry sticks that burned without smoke. "We will be a little careful about smoke," Harkness had warned them all. "No use of broadcasting the news of our being here. We have come a long way, and I think there is small chance of Schwartzmann's party or the savages finding us in this spot." Beyond the fire, Harkness raised himself now to sit erect and glance about the circle of fire-lit faces. "There's plenty of planning to be done," he said. "There is the matter of defense. We must build a barricade of some sort. As for shelter, we must remember that we will be here a long time and that we might as well face it. We will need to build some serviceable shelters. Then, what about clothes? These we are wearing are none the better for the trip through the jungle. They won't last forever. We've got to learn, Lord, we've got to learn so many things." And the first of many councils was begun. End of chapter 13. Of Brood of the Dark Moon by Charles Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A bag of green gas. Under a tree on the edge of the open ground, a notched stick hung. 6 sharply cut V's showed red through the white bark. Then one that was deeper, another 6, and another deeper cut. More of them until the stick was full. So passed the little days. "Some time," Herr Kreiss had promised, "I shall determine with accuracy the length of our Dark Moon days. Then we will convert these crude records into Earth time. It is good that we should not lose our knowledge of the days on Earth." He made a ceremony each morning of the cutting of another notch. Chet, too, had a bit of daily routine that was never neglected. Each sunrise found him on the high divide. Each morning he watched for the glint and sparkle of sunlight as it flashed from a metal ship, and each morning the reflected light came to him tinged with green, until he knew at last that it might never be different. The poisonous fumes filled the pocket at the end of the valley where the great ship rested. She was indeed at the bottom of a sea. Back at camp were other signs of the passing days. Around the top of the knoll a palisade had sprung up. Stakes buried in the ground, with sharpened ends pointing up and outward, were interwoven with tough vines to make a barricade that would check any direct assault. And within the enclosure, near the little hut that had been built for Diane, were other shelters. One black night of tropical rainstorm had taught the necessity for roofs that would protect them from torrential downpours. These did well enough for the present, these temporary shelters and defenses, and they had kept Diane and the two men working like mad when it was essential that they have something to do, something to think of, that they might not brood too long and deeply on their situation and the life of exile they were facing. For Kreiss this was not necessary. In Herr Kreiss, it seemed, were the qualities of the stoic. They were exiled, that was a fact. Herr Kreiss accepted it and put it aside. For about him were countless things animate and inanimate of this new world, things which must be taken into his thin hands, examined, classified, and catalogued in his mind. In the rocky outcrop at the top of their knoll he had found a cave with which this rock seemed honeycombed. Here, within the shelter of the barricade, he had established what he called very seriously his laboratory, and here he brought strange animals from the jungle, flying things that were more like bats than birds, yet colored gorgeously. Chet found him one day quietly exultant over a wrinkled piece of parchment. He was sharpening a quill into a pen, and a cup-shaped stone held some dark liquid that was evidently ink. "So much data to record," he said. "There will be others who will follow us some day. Perhaps not during our lifetime, but they will come. These discoveries are mine. I must have the record for them. And later I will make paper," he added as an afterthought. "There is papyrus growing in the lake." But on the whole Kreiss kept strictly to himself. "He's a lone wolf," Chet told the others, "and now that he is bringing in those heavy loads of metals he is more exclusive than ever. Won't let me into the back end of his cave." "Does he think we'll steal his gold?" Harkness asked moodily. "What good is gold to us here?" "He may have gold," Chet informed him, "but he has something more valuable, too. I saw some chunks that glowed in the dark. Rotten with radium, he told me. But even so, he is welcome to it. We can't use it. No, I don't think he suspects us of wanting his trophies. He's merely the kind that flocks by himself. He's having a wonderful time today, pounding out some of his metals with a stone hammer. I heard him at it all day. He seems to have settled down in that cave for keeps." Harkness threw another stick across the fire. Its warmth was unneeded, but its dancing flames were cheering. "And that is something we must make up our minds about," he said slowly. "Are we to stay here, or should we move on?" He dropped to the ground near where Diane was sitting and took one of her hands in his. "Diane and I plan to set up housekeeping," he told Chet, and Chet saw him smile whimsically at the words. Housekeeping on the Dark Moon would be primitive indeed. "We are lacking in some of the customary features of a wedding. We seem to be just out of ministers or civil officials to tie the knot." "Elect me mayor of Dianeville," Chet suggested with a grin, "and I'll marry you, if you think those formalities are necessary here." Diane broke in. "It's foolish of me, Chet. I know it. But don't laugh at me." He saw her lips tremble for an instant. "You see, we're so far away from everything, and it seems that if Walter and I could just start our lives with a really and truly marriage—" "Oh, I know it is foolish." This time Chet interrupted. "After all you have been through, and after the bravery you have shown, I think you are entitled to a little foolishness. And you shall be married with as good a knot as any minister could tie. You see, that is one of the advantages of being a master pilot. My warrant permits me to perform a marriage service in any level above the surface of the earth, a leftover from the time when ship's captains had the same right. And although we are grounded for keeps, if we are not above the surface of the earth right now, I don't know anything about altitudes. But," he added, as if it were an afterthought, "my fee, although I hate to mention it, is $5. Harkness gravely reached into the pocket of his ragged coat and brought out a wallet. He tendered a $5 bill to Chet. "I think you're robbing me," he complained, "but that's what happens when there is no competition. And we'll start building a house tomorrow." "Will we?" Chet inquired. "Is this the best place? For my part, I would feel safer if there were more miles between us and that pyramid. What was down in there, God knows. But there was something back of that hypnotized ape, something that knocked us for a crash landing with one look from those eyes. The night air was warm where he lay before their huts, but a shiver of apprehension gripped him at the thought of a mysterious something that was beyond the power of his imagination, and that was an enemy they would never want to face. Something inhuman in its cold brutality, yet superhuman, too, if this mental force were an indication. A something different from anything the people of Earth had ever known, bestial and damnable. "I am with you on that," Harkness agreed. "But what about the ship? You have had your eye on it every day. Do we want to go where we could not see it? If the gas cleared, if there was ever a season when the wind changed, think of what that would mean. Ammunition, food, supplies of all kinds, and the ship as a place of refuge, too, would be lost. No, we can't turn that over to Schwartzmann, Chet. We've got to stick around." "I still wish we were farther away," Chet acknowledged, "but you are right." "Walt, we could never be satisfied a single day if we thought the ship could be reached. Then, too, Towahg seems to think this is okay. As near as I can learn from his sign language and a dozen words, this is about as good a spot as we can find. He says the ape-men never crossed the big divide. Something spooky about it, I judged. However, we must remember this. The fact that Towahg came across shows that the rest of them would if they found it could be done. That's why he has led us so far while we waded up that stream," offered Diane. "Trailing Towahg would be like trying to follow the wake of an airship." "And I asked him about the red vampires that jumped us down by the ship," Chet continued. "He gave me the clear sign on that, too." Diane was not anxious for more wanderings, as Chet could see. "There is game here," she suggested, "and the edge of the jungle is simply an orchard of fruit, as you know, and having a lake to bathe in is important. Oh, I must not try to influence you. We must do what is best." "No," said Chet, "our own wishes don't count. The ship's the deciding factor. You had better build your house here, Walt. Happy Valley will be headquarters for the expedition. We've got a whale of a lot of country to explore, and of course we will slip back and check up on Schwartzmann, find out where he went to." "Count me out," Harkness interrupted. "Count me out. You go and hunt for trouble if you want to. Diane and I will have our hands full right here. Great heavens, man, we've got to learn to make clothes. And by the way, that uniform you're wearing is no credit to your tailor. If we are to call this home, we must do better than the savages. I intend to find some bamboo, split it, make some troughs, and bring water down here from the spring. I've got to learn where Kreiss is getting his metal and find some soft enough to hammer into dishes. We can't call the department store by radiophone, you know, and have them shoot a bunch of the stuff out by pneumatic tube." "That's all right," Chet mocked. "By the time you have built a house with only a stone axe in your tool kit, you'll think the rest of it is simple." The barricade, or cheval de frise, as Chet insisted on calling it, to show his deep study of the wars of earlier days, was built in the form of a U. The knoll itself sloped on one side directly to the water's edge. They had left that side open and carried their line of sharp stakes down to the water, that in the event of a siege they would not be conquered by thirst. On the highest point of the knoll, some weeks later, a house was being built, a more pretentious structure this time than the other little huts. The aerial roots that the white trees dropped from their high-flung branches were not impossible to cut with their crude implements. They made good building material for a house whose framework must be tied together with vines and tough roots. This would be the home of Harkness and Diane. The two had been insistent that this structure would be incomplete without a room for Chet, but the pilot only laughed at that suggestion. "It's an old saying," he told them, "that one house isn't big enough for two families. I think the remark is as old as the institution of marriage, just about, and it's as true on the Dark Moon as it is on Earth. And besides, I intend to build some bachelor apartments that will make this place of yours look pretty cheap. That is, if I ever find time. I'm going to be pretty busy just roaming around this little world, seeing what I can see. Even Herr Kreiss has got the wanderlust, you will notice." "He has been gone 4 days," said Diane. Her tone was frankly worried. Chet finished tying a sapling to a row of uprights and slid to the ground. "Don't be alarmed about Kreiss," he reassured her. "He has been all fired mysterious for the past several weeks. He's been working on something in that cave of his, and visitors have not been admitted. When he left, he told me he would be gone for some time, and he looked at me like an owl when he said it. His mysterious secret was making his eyes pop out. He has a surprise up his sleeve." "Wedding present for Diane?" Harkness suggested. "Well, he showed me some darn nice sapphires," Chet agreed. "Probably found some way to cut them, and he's setting them in a bracelet of soft gold. That's my guess." "I wish he were here," Diane insisted. And Chet nodded across the clearing as he said fervently, "I wish I could get all my wishes as quickly as that. There he comes now with his bow in one hand and a bag of something in the other." The tall figure moved wearily across the open ground, but straightened and came briskly toward them as he drew near. He seemed more gaunt than usual, as if he had finished a long journey and had slept but little, but his eyes behind their heavy spectacles were big with pride. "You have, what do you Americans say, poked fun at my helplessness in the forest," he told Chet. "And now see, alone and without help, I have made a great journey, a most important journey." He held up a bladder, translucent, filled with something palely green. "The gas," he said proudly. "Why, Herr Kreiss," Diane exclaimed, amazed, "you can't mean that you've been to Fire Valley, that is the gas from about the ship. And why did you want it? What earthly use?" She had looked from the proud face of the scientist to that of Harkness, then turned toward Chet. Her voice died away, her question unfinished, at the sight of the expression in those other eyes. "From the ship? You mean that you've been there? Fire Valley? That you've come back here?" Chet was asking on behalf of Harkness as well. His companion added nothing to the words of the pilot, words spoken in a curiously quiet, strained tone. "But yes," Herr Kreiss assured him. His gaze was still proudly fixed upon the bladder of green gas. "I needed some for an experiment, a most important experiment." And not till then did he glance up and let his thin face wrinkle in amazed wonder at the look on the pilot's face. Chet raised one end of another stick as Kreiss approached. He had intended to place it against the frame they were building, but it fell heavily to the ground instead. He regarded Harkness with eyes that were somber with hopeless despair, yet that somehow crinkled with a whimsical smile. "Well, I said he had a surprise up his sleeve," he reminded them. "It's nearly night. I can't do anything now. I'll go tomorrow, take Towahg. I don't know that there's anything we can do, but we'll try." "You will stay here with Diane," he told Harkness, and Harkness accepted the order as he would from one who was in command. "It's up to you now," he told Chet. "I'll stay here and hold the fort. You're running the job from now on." But the pilot only nodded. Herr Kreiss was sputtering a barrage of hows and whys. He demanded to know why his success in so hazardous a trip should have this result. But Chet Bullard did not answer. He walked slowly away, his eyes on the ground, as one who is trying to plan, driving his thoughts in an effort to find some escape from a danger that seemed to hover threateningly. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Brood of the Dark Moon by Charles Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Terrors of the Jungle. Towahg had learned the names of these white-skinned ones who came down from whatever heaven was pictured in his rudimentary mind. His pronunciation of them was peculiar. It had not been helped any by reason of Diane's having been his teacher. Her French accent was delightful to hear, but not helpful to a Dark Moon ape-man who was grappling with English. But he knew them by name, using always the French monsieur, and when Chet repeated Monsieur Kreiss, he go, pointing through the jungle, and following this with the command, Towahg go, me go, the ape-man's unlovely face drew into its hideous grin, and he nodded his head violently to show that he understood. Chet gripped a hand each of Harkness and Diane and clung to them for a moment. Below their knoll the white morning mist drifted eerily toward the lake. The knoll was an island, and they three the only living creatures in a living world. It was the first division of their little force, the first parting where any such farewell might be the last. The silence hung heavily about them. "Au revoir," Diane said softly, "and take no chances. Come back here and we'll win or lose together." "Blue skies," was Walt Harkness' goodbye in the language of the flyer. "Blue skies and happy landings." And Chet, before the shrouding mist swallowed him up, replied in kind. "Lifting off," he announced, as if his ship were rising beneath him, "and the air is cleared. I'll drop back in 4 days if I'm lucky." Towahg was waiting, curled up for warmth in the hollow of a great tree's roots. Like all the ape-men, he was sullen and taciturn in the chill of the morning. Not until the sun warmed him would he become his customary self. But he grunted when Chet repeated his instructions. "Monsieur Kreiss, he go. Now Towahg go, too. Go where Monsieur Kreiss go." And he led the way into the jungle where the scientist had emerged. Chet followed close through the wraith-like, drifting mist. They were ascending a gentle slope. Among the trees and tangled giant vines the mist grew thin. Then they were above it, and occasional shafts of golden light shot flatly in to mark the ascending sun. They were climbing toward the big divide, that much Chet knew. White, ghostly trees gave place to the darker, gloomier growth of the uplands. Strange monstrosities they had been to Chet when first he had seen them, but he was accustomed to them now and passed unnoticing among their rubbery trunks, so black and shining with morning dew. Far above, a wind moved among the pliant branches that whipped and whirled their elastic lengths into strange, curled forms. Then the miracle of the daily growth of leaves took place, and the rubbery limbs were clothed in green, where golden flowers budded prodigiously before they flashed open and filled the wet air with their fragrance. They were following the path that Chet had traveled on his morning trips to the divide for a view of the ship. Kreiss would have gone this way, of course, although to Chet there was no sign of his having passed. Then came the divide, and still Chet followed where Towahg led sullenly across the expanse of barren rocks. Towahg's head was sunk between his black shoulders, his long arms hung limply, and he moved on with a steady motion of his short, heavily muscled legs, with apparently no thought of where he went or why. Chet stopped for a moment's look at the distant sparkle that meant the shining ship, which shone green as on every other day, and he wondered, as if he had a score of times, if it might be possible for them to make a suit, a bag to enclose his head, or a gas mask, anything that could be made gas-tight, and he could be supplied with air. Then he thought of the bow that was slung on his shoulder and the stone axe at his belt. These were their implements. These were all they had. Suddenly he began to walk rapidly down the slope after Towahg, who was almost to the trees. Again they were among the black, rubbery growth. It rose from a tangle of mammoth-leafed vines and creepers that wove themselves into an impassable wall. Impassable until Towahg lifted a huge leaf here, swung a hanging vine there, and laid open a passage through the living labyrinth. How did Kreiss ever find his way? Chet asked himself, and then he questioned. Did he come this way? Is Towahg on the trail? Again he repeated his instructions to the ape man, and he showed his own wonder as to which way they should go. The sun must have done its work effectively, for now Towahg's wide grin was in evidence. He nodded vigorously, then dropped to one knee and motioned for Chet to see for himself as he pointed to his proof. Chet stared at the unbroken ground. Was a tiny leaf crushed? It might have been, but so were 1,000 others that had fallen from above. He shook his head, and Towahg could only show his elation by hopping ludicrously from one foot to the other in a dance of joy. Then he went on at a pace Chet found difficulty in following, until they came to a place where Towahg tore a vine aside to show easier going, but climbed instead over a fallen tree, grown thickly with vines, and here even Chet could see that other feet had tripped and stumbled. The master pilot glanced at the triple star still pinned to his blouse. He thought of the study and training that had preceded the conferring of that rating, the charting of the stars, navigational problems in a three-dimensional sea, and he smiled at his failure to read this trail that to Towahg was entirely plain. "Every man to his job," he told the black, and patted him on the shoulder. "And you know yours, Towahg. You're good. Now where do we sleep?" He ventured to suggest a bed of leaves that had gathered amongst a maze of great rocks, but Towahg registered violent disapproval. He pointed to a pendant vine. His hands that were clumsy at so many things gave an unmistakable imitation of a bud that developed on that vine and opened. Then Towahg sniffed once at that imaginary flower, and his body went suddenly limp and apparently lifeless as it fell to the ground. "You're right, old top," Chet assured him as Towahg came again to his feet. "This is no place to take a nap." A crashing of some enormous body that tore the tough jungle in its rush came from beyond the rocks. "And there are other reasons," he added as he followed Towahg's example and leaped for a hanging tangle of laced vines. Here was a ladder ready to take them to the high roof above, but they did not need it. The crashing died away in the distance. It was Chet's first intimation that this section of the Dark Moon held beasts more huge than the moon pigs he had killed. It was a disturbing bit of knowledge. He caught Towahg's cautious, wary eyes and motioned toward the branches high overhead. "How about hanging ourselves up there for the night?" he asked, and the gestures, though not the words, were plain as the ape man's quick descent made clear. He motioned Chet to follow. Down they plunged, and always down. Towahg gave Chet to understand that Kreiss had slept some distance beyond. They would try to reach the same place. But the quick falling dusk caught them while yet among the black rubbery trees, and the dark showed Chet why their branches might not be inviting as a sleeping place. By ones and twos they came at first, occasional lines of light that flowed swiftly and vanished through the black tangle of limbs. Chet could hardly believe them real. They appeared and were lost from sight as if they had melted. But more came, and it seemed at last as if the roof above were alive with light. The moving, luminous things glowed in hues that were never still, were pure gold, were green, then red, melting and changing through all the colors of the spectrum. Living fireworks that were a blaze of gorgeous beauty. They wove an ever-moving canopy of softest lights that raced dazzlingly to and fro. They crossed and intertwined, that were dazzling to his eyes while they held his senses enthralled by their color and sheer loveliness, until one light detached itself and fell toward him where he stood spellbound beside a giant fern. It struck softly behind him, and its crimson glory flashed yellow as it struck, and then went black, and in the dim light, on a green leathery leaf with a spread of 10 feet, Chet saw an enormous worm whose head was a thing of writhing antennae, whose eyes were pure deadliness, and whose round, corrugated body drew up the hanging parts that the leaf could not hold. It hunched itself into a huge inverted U, and, before Chet could recover from his horrified surprise, was poised to spring. It was Towahg's strength, not his own, that threw him bodily down the path. It was Towahg who poured a volley of grunted words and shrieks into his ear while he dragged him back. Chet saw the vicious head flash to the loveliest gold while it shot forward to the body's full 12 feet of length, 12 feet of pulsing lavender and rose and flashing crimson that was more horrible by reason of its beauty. Chet stumbled to his feet and raced after Towahg. The ape-man moved in swift silence, Chet close at his back, and other luminous horrors dropped on ropes of translucent silver behind them, until the ghostly white of friendly trees became visible, and they stood at last, breathless and shaken as far as Chet was concerned, in the familiar jungle of the lower valleys. And Towahg, to whom poison vines and writhing, horrible worms of death that had failed to make him their prey were things of a forgotten past, curled up in the shelter of an outflung snarl of great roots, grunted once, and went calmly to sleep. But Chet Bullard, accustomed only to man-made dangers that would have held Towahg petrified with fear, lay long, staring into the dark. End of chapter 15.